Good afternoon, everyone. This is Wendy Noss, Executive Director of COSSA, and welcome to this month's COSSA Headlines, which is our monthly look at what's new and noteworthy in social science policy. If you're new to this activity, what we like to do is to take a little bit of time to talk with you about what's going on in the social and behavioral science policy world, the view from Washington, as it were. And then have a deep dive conversation on a particularly timely topic. And there's nothing more timely these days than COVID-19, and in particular, how our community is responding with the information that's needed to address the pandemic. So we have a really interesting deep dive discussion for you today with Monica Feit, and we will let her tell us all about this new initiative in a few minutes. And then at the end, we like to end with some items that you can do this month if you want to be involved in COSSA advocacy or activities or other things, should you wish to stay involved. So thank you for joining us today, and we'll jump right in. This is supposed to be a two-way conversation, so feel free to ask questions at any time. Our team is monitoring the chat box, so feel free to type in any questions you have, either about the headlines topics that I'm going to review, or if you have questions for our speaker today. And then we will open up the lines later so you can have a conversation with Monica directly as well. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into what's new and noteworthy this month. Well, as many of you know who are in the DC world and work in policy, we are at the height of appropriations process right now as we near the end of the fiscal year at the end of September. As it has become customary, there is this last minute rush to finish as many appropriations bills as possible before the summer recess, and certainly before the November elections, when everything grinds to a halt here in Washington. So you will be seeing a lot of reporting by COSSA and other groups that I'm sure you're involved in about what's coming out of the House and Senate for 2021 appropriations. We started to see markups in the House this week for the bills that fund the agencies we care about: NIH, NSF, Department of Education, Department of Justice, Census, and so on. But we don't have all the details yet. Congress has the details, and they're working through their process, and we expect to see reports of those bills in the next week. So stay tuned to our policy section of our webpage, or watch your email, because we will be doing a really in-depth analysis of what these bills include. And the Senate will follow suit when they return. All this, though, is to say that once the bills are out there, the process kind of stalls for a while. We'll have summer recess, we'll have the elections, and usually in an election year, the outcome of appropriations depends on the outcome of the election. So if the Democrats take the White House, for example, or if either chamber of Congress flips, usually they like to enact a continuing resolution to push appropriations into next year, so that the new party in power has some say over it. So it really is really unknown what the process is going to be going forward. But it is important to know what's coming out of these bills, because that will be a starting point when the final negotiations happen. So again, stay tuned for our coverage of the bills, which you'll start seeing from us within the next week. There's lots of other appropriation, authorizing and appropriations related legislation happening on the Hill these days, again, in the sort of last minute rush to finish things before the end of the fiscal year. A particular note is that the House and Senate drafts of the authorization bill for the Department of Defense, which is known as the National Defense Authorization Act, they both include language that would reverse cuts to the Minerva Research Initiative at DOD. It's DOD's basic research program, social science research program. So if you're at a university, you may be familiar with this activity. A big chunk of that funding was proposed for elimination in the president's budget, but thanks to advocacy from a bunch of organizations, including COSSA, and all working very closely together, we were able to ensure that elimination didn't go through. What's really interesting about the NDAA legislation is that while it's authorizing legislation, not appropriations, it essentially has the force of law when it comes to funding. So the House and Senate enact defense authorization legislation, and then the appropriations bills appropriate basically everything that's in the authorization bill. So having this language in these bills is actually really important and signals that we will in fact have funding for the Minerva program come next year, fiscal year 2021. So that's a huge win for our community. So congrats to all there. And we'll watch that process as it goes through to the end to make sure that that funding is solidified. Another piece of legislation you might be hearing about is the RISE Act. This is the Research Investment to Spark the Economy Act, another DC acronym, that was introduced by Representatives DeGette, a Democrat from Colorado, and Upton, a Republican from Michigan. And it would authorize $26 billion in relief funding for federal science agencies to support researchers, not research itself, but the research sort of economy affected by the COVID pandemic. So funds would be used for graduate students, postdoctoral researchers, for PIs to complete work that was disrupted by COVID, or extending training or employment of researchers on existing research projects. So again, not new money for new research, but to sort of right the ship in a way for the research community. $26 billion, but again, this is unlike the DoD bill. This is authorizing legislation, not appropriations. But what this bill does by being introduced is it makes it easier for when there is a new COVID supplemental appropriations bill, perhaps in the coming weeks. I've heard perhaps late July, early August, we could actually see a brokered deal for another COVID bill. This could easily be inserted into that. So we'll be keeping a very close eye on it. Obviously, the research and the higher ed communities are very supportive of this. $26 billion is likely not enough, but we're happy that it's a place to start as we talk about recovery. So stay tuned for more details on that. All right, policing legislation. We're seeing a ton of policing legislation in the wake of mass protests throughout the country over the last several weeks, and likely continuing into the summer. And the bills themselves are covering a range of topics, from de-escalation training to better reporting of police use of force, to more substantial reforms to policing, including labeling chokeholds as potential civil rights violations, denying grants to some police jurisdictions, and so on. As you might expect, the House and Senate are taking very different approaches to policing legislation, given that there are different parties in charge of both chambers. But interestingly, we are also seeing research legislation related to policing coming out of the House. In particular, the House Science Committee Chair, Representative Eddie Bernice Johnson of Texas, a Democrat, introduced the Promoting Fair and Effective Policing Through Research Act. And this would create a program or a mandate for the National Science Foundation to fund social and behavioral science research on policing practices and the mitigation of police violence. So allowing the SBE Directorate to fund research in this way, in this area, studying things like bias and so on. Likely, these are things that SBE already has the ability to fund, but I think it's important to recognize more than anything that what this legislation says is that the House and the Science Committee in particular recognizes the value of social and behavioral science research, and that including SBE and SBS in challenges of national significance, such as the policing issue, is an important step. So this is a messaging bill in a lot of ways. There's no Senate counterpart, But if there is sweeping policing legislation that is introduced in the coming months, perhaps, this could be something that could be rolled into that. So it's worth noting, but I don't see it on a fast track right now to become law. Okay, let's turn to what's happening in the executive branch. There's a lot happening there as well. All right, so if you're in a university, if you're in an association that is closely following how federal science agencies are responding to the COVID-19 pandemic and its effect on researchers, you're likely aware of a memo from the office, the White House Office of Management and Budget from back in June that would extend certain administrative flexibilities to grant recipients as part of the relief for the pandemic. In response to this OMB memo, NIH and NSF have issued their own guidance statements clarifying how they plan to sort of implement these flexibilities. And you can see the link on our screen there where you can see the versions, the House and Senate, the NIH and the NSF statements in response to the memo. But what they explain is that the flexibilities include allowance to continue charging salaries, benefits, and other applicable program costs to active NIH and NSF awards through the end of the fiscal year, so September 30th. But there's a big caveat there, assuming that payroll costs have not already been paid through other COVID-19 relief programs. So there's some concern among the research community, certainly, that what does it mean by using expending other sources of funding before you can apply, salary costs and whatnot to active grants. So it's really important to read carefully these NIH and NSF statements because they try to clarify what it actually means for our community. Okay, let's see. In happy news, we have or will soon have in the coming weeks a new NSF director, Sethuraman Panchanathan, who we've reported on a few times, was confirmed by the Senate. So now it's just a matter of getting him in place, whatever that means these days, perhaps remotely. So expect to see a lot more happening at NSF over the coming months as the agency adjusts to new leadership and someone with a different background than we've had over the last 6 years. And we're very excited for Panch to come on board. He's very supportive of social and behavioral science. He knows the NSF community incredibly well. So we will be following his steps closely as he takes the reins. Okay, hot off the presses for sure. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen through just the general press that the Trump administration released a policy earlier this week with really no notice, blocking international students from coming to or remaining in the US if their courses are taught entirely online. And this has been met with major uproar from students, from institutions of higher ed, including Harvard and MIT, who have since sued the administration to stop this move. But in the meantime, the policy has really thrown colleges and the lives of 1 million or so international students into turmoil during what are already really challenging times. So since this is a very new development and there's lawsuits involved, we will be working closely with our colleagues in the higher ed world and watching how this plays out over the next few weeks. And as we learn things from AAU or APLU or from the Hill, we will certainly report back to you all with that information. Okay, wanted to just flag one new interesting funding opportunity for you all. So at NIH, the National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities has been issuing several COVID-related social and behavioral science funding opportunities over the last couple of weeks. If you go to our website, our COSSA Washington Update website, there is a listing of active grants, and you'll see a bunch from NIMHD. This latest one is for community interventions to address the consequences of COVID-19 among health disparity and vulnerable populations. And they're especially looking for applicants to address things like adverse psychosocial, behavioral, and socioeconomic consequences of the pandemic on the health of these populations. And applications are open at the end of this month and will be accepted through the end of August. So definitely an opportunity for our community, and incredibly timely. If you know folks working in this space, would encourage you to share this with them. And the link is on the screen to the actual funding opportunity. Okay, we like to share news from what's happening elsewhere in the community. I'm not going to talk about Sean, but here's a link to some of the work that Monica is going to talk about in a couple of minutes. So I will skip that for right now. And then we like to share what's new with COSSA. And this month we featured a piece from The Conversation, if you're familiar with that publication, on social science as it relates to several different aspects of policing. Really interesting pieces from some research colleagues at different universities talking about what social science is telling us about policing in this country. So I would encourage you to check out that at whysocialscience.com, and certainly let us know if there are topics that you would like Why Social Science to feature. We would welcome those ideas, or if any of you have things that you would like to share through this medium, please do let us know. All of these topics and so many others are covered in our COSSA Washington Update that comes out every other week, so hopefully you're receiving that. You can find a lot more information than what I'm able to say to you in a span of 15 minutes on our website. All right, I'll pause just for a second here. I don't see any questions in the chat box. If anyone had any burning questions about any of those topics, you can ask them now, or you can hold them until later on, let them simmer a little bit, and then you can ask them towards the end. Okay, great. Well, let's not waste any more time. Likely you're here to hear from Monica Feit. So we're really excited today to give you a chance to hear more about the Societal Experts Action Network, or SEAN, which is a new activity coming out of the National Academies in partnership with the National Science Foundation. Monica is the Deputy Director for the Division of Behavioral and Social Sciences and Education at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. Many of you are aware of certainly the National Academies and DBAS in particular, and Monica has been there since 2017. She's also worked in the Senior Executive Service at HHS and as a Senior Program Officer at the Institute of Medicine at the National Academies, which is the National Academy of Medicine now, and has worked on topics such as integration of primary care and public health, the health of LGBT populations, and so on. And in 2009, she was named an American Public Health Association Government Fellow and worked as a staffer on the U.S. Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, one of the committees that that we very much care about and closely monitor, as it oversees a lot of science and health related policy. So Monica is here. She's going to talk to us about the SEAN activity. And again, we want to hear your ideas and your questions. So hold on to those, type them in the box, or you can unmute yourself towards the end of the call. I will turn things over to you, Monica.
Thank you, Wendy. It's really exciting to be here. And you can start my slides. I'm here today to talk about, as Wendy said, the Societal Experts Action Network, which we refer to lovingly as SEAN. And this is an activity that is housed at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and it's managed in DBAS, the Division of Behavioral and Social Sciences and Education. And the idea behind Sean is to really link social scientists with decision makers who have questions right now about COVID-19 so that we can facilitate rapid and actionable responses to those questions. Next slide. So before I jump into Sean, let me first talk a little bit about what the National Academies is doing in response to COVID-19. So Sean is one of the things that we're doing, but we have a resource page we've created, and I've added the link so you can go check it out. It has a bunch of activities that we've already done. You can look at archived webcasts for a whole range of topics we've done webinars on. It has a list of our upcoming activities. So if you would like to sit in on some public workshops, you're welcome to do that. It also has additional resources based on studies that we've done at the institution or other things that we're doing around COVID. So that's just a nice resource page. We also have launched the Standing Committee on Emerging Infectious Diseases and 21st Century Health Threats. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a second, because that was really sort of the pioneer before Sean, and we've been following in its steps in many ways. And then finally, the institution is still continuing on with its work. We're doing all kinds of normal things that we do, but in the area of COVID, we're doing some fast track consensus studies. So these are studies where we still bring in experts, we still have a specific statement of task, we review the literature, but then we're able to offer some recommendations in this space. And so one example of a fast track study that is housed in DBAS is one that we're doing. It'll be released next week, and it provides guidance to K through 12 schools on COVID and reopening. And so if you've been paying attention to the news, that's been in the news a lot lately. So we're hoping that that will be helpful as schools and states and school districts grapple with what they're going to do in the fall. So that's just one example of these fast track consensus studies. You know, that study I think started 4 weeks ago, maybe. So it's an example of us being able to rapidly bring together experts and provide some guidance on really important topics. Next slide. So this is a little bit about the Standing Committee, the Standing Committee on Emerging Infectious Diseases. And it started in March, and it started as a request through the White House's Office of Science and Technology Policy and Department of Health and Human Services Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response. So those are all the letters, OSTP and HHS ASPR. And so they really wanted a mechanism to answer questions that they had about COVID and to do it rapidly. So the Academy set up this standing committee. It's chaired by Harvey Feinberg. And if you don't know Harvey, he's a terrific guy, but he's also the former president of what was the Institute of Medicine before it became the National Academy of Medicine. So he's well positioned to chair this committee. It has 27 members. They've added some members over time. The committee doesn't actually, meet formally very regularly. I think they've only met 2 or 3 times, but it's a large group of people, and they can draw on their expertise rapidly through sort of subgroups that are meeting or ad hoc activities. They have pioneered a new product for us at the academies, something we're calling a rapid expert consultation. They've done 11 of these at this point, and the idea is that when there's a technical question, and early on there was a question, for example, about what do we know about the virus in summer? Is the virus going to go away during summer? And so when there's a question like that, we can use this rapid expert consultation as a way to pull together a small group of people who can quickly review literature if there is literature, because in some cases there's not, and then based on their own scientific expertise, offer up some guidance. So it doesn't reflect consensus. It is not sort of a thorough review of the literature. The idea behind it is to rapidly respond when there is a question. And so in that case, they said that nothing that they had reviewed indicated that the virus would slow down in the summer, which We didn't know if that would be true or not at the time they issued it, but it looks like they were kind of right on the money with that one. So they have put out 11 of these, and they did them in a pretty short period of time, 6 weeks, I think they put out 11 of these. So this is incredibly rapid for the national academies, but we recognize that it's important to get answers to people who need them during this particular time. They've also done some telephonic consultations, which is where they literally linked somebody in the Office of Science and Technology Policy with an expert by phone and said, ask them your questions and let the expert answer them to the best of their ability. So we've really also tried to play this role of connecting the experts with the people who need answers. So the standing committee was the first group to sort of set up this process. They also are working with other parts of the academies on some of these consensus studies that I mentioned. So for instance, the one on providing guidance to K-12 education is affiliated with the standing committee. And the standing committee is also currently working on data needs to monitor the evolution of the virus as it's evolving. What kind of data will you need so you can keep track of that? So they're not only doing these rapid expert consultations, but they're affiliated with a number of products that seem appropriate for the kind of question that people have and the way that we feel like it's best to respond. So as the standing committee was getting launched, it was getting up and running, it was quickly turning around these rapid expert consultations, it became clear that a lot of the questions that were coming in had social science connections, right? They were really, the answers were rooted in social and behavioral science, and that while they added some members who have backgrounds in social science, that this wasn't really going to be adequate. So that was really the idea that helped us launch SEAN. So that's the next slide. So SEAN, the Societal Experts Action Network, is been funded by NSF. NSF was really, they were watching what was happening with the standing committee, and they were recognizing there was a need for social science at the same time that we in the institution, in DBAS in particular, were also becoming cognizant of this and trying to figure out what we could do so that we could support the standing committee, but also make sure that we were able to draw on the richness of the literature that we know from the social sciences. And so through numerous conversations with NSF, they decided to fund this network, SEAN. And so the idea, similar to the standing committee, is that you really want to link decision makers with researchers who can provide guidance, drawing on the social, behavioral, and economic sciences to help inform responses to issues that decision makers have about COVID-19. So one of the differences, and I'll talk a little bit about this more in a minute, is that by having funding from NSF, it gave us at the Academy some flexibility to not only respond to federal decision makers. The standing committee really needs to be responsive to their sponsors, and that's the White House and HHS. But with this flexibility, we're able to proactively reach out to state and local decision makers. And as this pandemic has unfolded, it's clear that those are really key levels of government. And that's where a lot of these questions are coming from. And we wanted to be able to connect the researchers that we know with the questions that decision makers on these levels, state and local, were having. So that's another unique feature of SEAN. SEAN is affiliated with the standing committee. I'll explain a link. There's a pretty explicit link in just a minute. And then the other idea was that you really wanted to evaluate how we were doing with this approach with the network. And you want to evaluate two different things. The first is, does this process make sense? Does it make sense? Is it really working to connect academics who really know social science with decision makers who may not know social science, but they've got real questions and they need to make policy decisions? And is this network effective in providing what they need? And then the second part of the evaluation is, what is the impact you're having? Are you actually meeting the needs of decision makers by producing the kinds of products that we expect that SEAN will be producing? So there's an evaluation component to this. And depending on the evaluation, we could imagine a scenario where you had a Sean type network that was helping decision makers post-COVID, right? I mean, I think decision makers have lots of questions that the social and behavioral sciences are poised to answer. And so while we're using this moment as an opportunity to really link the two, it may prove to be a useful kind of network that would have applicability beyond the pandemic. And I think the evaluation will help us know that. Okay, so next slide. Let me tell you a little bit about some key features of Sean. So first of all, the governing structure is an executive committee, and there are 8 members of the executive committee. I have their names coming up in just a second, and so you can see who they are. And it's the executive committee that really makes decisions about what Sean will do and what kinds of questions Sean will take on. And what they think about is, they think about, one, is this the kind of question that we could answer in a rapid way? So, and I'll give you an example in a minute, but some of the questions we've gotten have are not really, they don't really lend themselves to this sort of rapid response. And then do we feel like there is an evidence base that we can draw on? Do the social sciences have something to say about this question? And so that's really the lens that they're using when we figure out what kinds of products we're going to do, the kinds of projects that Sean will take on. But they don't do this alone. They do this working through a Sean advisory group. And this is a much larger group of people. There's over 20 people right now, and it's the kind of group where we anticipate we may add other members as we go along. And this group is really central to connecting Sean with all the various nodes of the network. So we have some members of the advisory group who are from the National Governors Association, somebody from the National Association of Counties. We have a former mayor on this. So we have members of this group who can connect to decision makers. We also have members of the group who connect to specific SBE institutions. So Jim Paterba is on the group from National Bureau of Economic Research. We have Alondra Nelson from SSRC. So we have some direct representation to some of the larger SBE institutions. We also have connections to survey research. We have a representative from Pew and from KFF. So we've got some access to some actual data that we're learning from surveys. And then there's a whole communications component to this. Because we want to make sure that we not only are answering questions decision makers have, but that we are more broadly disseminating responses to a wider audience. So that's the structure. Again, the outreach is to federal, state, and local decision makers, and it's a proactive outreach. We use both staff-to-staff connections, and we're also using the connections we have through the advisory group. And then when we get the questions in, we want to make sure that the responses, first of all, tap into what we know from the field. So we want to make sure that we're pulling in key experts who can point us in the right direction and help draft responses. But we also want to make sure that the responses are short and they're written for a policy audience. We expect that, the first thing that we've put out, I'll talk about in a minute. Wendy just gave a shout out to us, so thanks for that. But we put out a rapid expert consultation. But we're not sure that everything that we're going to put out will be rapid expert consultations. We maybe do some telephonic linking like the standing committee did. There may be other documents that would be appropriate, but the lens for that is making sure it's appropriate for a policy audience so that policymakers can use it. We're really lucky because one asset that the Sean Network has is a group of translators. And so these are scientists who worked in the last administration. And so they know how policymakers think and they know how to write for policymakers. And so we're working closely with them to also make sure that the things that we produce will be appropriate for our target audience. And then finally, dissemination. We feel like social sciences have a lot to say. And so in addition to responding to decision makers, whenever we can, whenever it's not sensitive, we want to widely disseminate the responses that we produce because we think that there's a wider audience for them. So that is a piece that's built into this. Next slide. So this is a list of the Sean Executive Committee. I won't spend very long going over this. I think the slides will be available and you can see all the members right there. But they are a great group of people who have been willing to so far have meetings on weekends and evenings and whenever we need to, because everybody is committed to the fact that this is a unique time and we need to be as responsive as possible. So next slide. This is kind of a complicated slide, I will admit, but the idea here is to show you graphically how the standing committee that was first set up and how Sean interacts and how Sean does its work. So you can see in the gold box, that's the Standing Committee on Emerging Infectious Diseases. And so that's the one chaired by Harvey Feinberg, and you can see in the red box above it that it was funded by the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy and HHS. So its responses are aimed at that target audience. That's its target audience. Within the standing committee, and again, I mentioned I think there's like 27 members at this time. At one point, they broke into smaller groups, and one working group really dealt more with population issues and some societal issues. And the chairs of that group are Bob Groves from Georgetown and Mary Bassett from the Harvard School of Public Health. And so the chairs of that group are also, if you follow the arrow, they're the co-chairs of the Sean Executive Committee. And so their name was on the list of the 8 people there, but they provide an explicit link between overseeing the Sean Network and linking back to the Standing Committee. And that way, when questions come into the Standing Committee that have a social science component, we're able to funnel that part to Sean. And at the same time as Sean is doing work, we're able to keep Standing Committee in the loop. So they play that connector function. Then below that is the Sean Advisory Group. And again, that's a large group of connectors. And you can see the boxes that they connect to. They connect to policymakers, they connect to disciplines and SBE institutions, surveys, the translators I mentioned, and again, there's a big communications piece to this. And then the last piece to just point out again, as I mentioned before, is the top red box. We're really working for not only federal policymakers, but state and local decision makers as well. So that's one of the big differences. Okay, next slide. So that is Sean. That's how we're set up. And this is the first product that we put out, which was a guide for decision makers on how to think about the data that they have available when they are trying to make decisions related to COVID-19. So we produced this in just a few weeks. It's fairly short, certainly short for Academy standards. I would argue it may not be short enough for policymakers, but we have an executive summary that's very short. And we really wanted to be able to distribute this information in lots of different ways. So we have a PDF. I think this is a slide of the actual PDF. But next slide. We also put it up on our website and created a more interactive version. It's the same information, but for people who want to not read a PDF and use their phone or their tablet or their computer, they can access the information in the same way here. And then next slide. One of the key takeaways from this document was this table that we produced. And it looked at different data types, and those are on the left, the confirmed cases, hospitalizations, ED visits, and then it looked at them across some criteria that's on the top, so like representativeness, bias, sampling error, those sorts of things. And so we tried to create sort of a quick way for decision makers to be able to check out the different kinds of data they had and see if with a green check that data type was pretty good against that particular criterion, or if with a caution sign, it just meant they needed to be aware that there are some other questions to think about. And the idea with this table was that you didn't want to scare decision makers off using data because they're going to make decisions regardless. So you just wanted to guide them so they had a better idea of what the limitations were with the data that they were making decisions. We still want them to use data to make decisions. We just wanted to give them a better idea about how to evaluate the data that they were using. So you can see the data don't look especially good on this slide, But if you go to the next slide, which is the bottom half of the table, it looks a little bit better. And then you can see there at the bottom is the website for Sean. And so the idea was that this is actually a standalone document on the Sean website. And so for people who just wanted to distribute the table, they could do that. For people who wanted a link to the more interactive version of the product, they had that. And then we have our more traditional PDF that people could forward on. So we really are trying to reach decision makers in ways that will resonate with them, with information that they can sort of use in real time. So next slide. This is, hopefully it will look better in the slide deck when you can see it, but this was a one-pager that we created. And we used the First Sean product to reach out to these decision maker groups, such as US Conference of Mayors, National League of Cities, groups like that, to explain, not only give an example of what Sean could do with the data guide, but also give them this one pager, which just quickly tries to explain how the social sciences can be helpful and what Sean can do for them. And so we really used it almost as a calling card to invite more questions. And the good news is we've gotten some more questions. So if you'll go to the next slide, I can talk a little bit about some of the next topics that Sean will likely take on. We've gotten questions on how you can effectively do contact tracing. We've gotten questions on compliance and how you can encourage people to comply with protective strategies. We've gotten some questions on environmental and natural disasters in COVID. For instance, how do you prepare for hurricane season? How do you prepare for floods? What do communities need to do, especially within their existing resources, to help prepare for those? There have been a number of questions about not only the homeless population, but about evictions. And as evictions that have been on hold start to ramp up, what do you do? And how can we help inform policy decisions in that area? There's a lot of questions around correctional facilities and mitigating the spread within correctional facilities. And then there's questions thinking more down the line about having a vaccine, and what do you do about vaccine hesitancy, and what can we be doing now? So there are many other questions we've gotten. These questions are ones that we thought that the social sciences were sort of poised to answer. So these are the ones we're grappling with now. We're not going to be able to do all of these questions, and we're certainly not going to be able to do all of them at the same time, but it's likely that we will do one or two of these as the next sort of projects that we take on. And then for my last slide, I just wanted to point you to the Sean website. It's nationalacademies.org/Sean, where you can get some more information. You can certainly reach out to me if you have questions. There's also a Sean email. And what it would be terrific that we could get from you is, one, for all of you who actually are having conversations with decision makers, questions that you're hearing, if you could let us know about those, ones that you think would be appropriate for Sean to answer, you can reach out to me, or you can just use the Sean email, which we check regularly, and let us know. So if you're hearing questions that you think this would be an appropriate mechanism for answering them, we would love to get those. And then as questions do come up, we will be reaching out to the field and asking for experts in these areas. We're using sort of a snowball strategy where you start asking people and they give you other names. And so just don't be surprised if we reach out to you. And then finally, if you do go onto the Sean website, we would love to have you sign up for our distribution list, because it would be really helpful when we do produce something if you're all able to share it with your own networks and to get the word out so that we can more widely disseminate the importance of social sciences. Okay, it looks like maybe there's some questions in the chat, and that's my talk.
Thank you, Monica. That's fantastic. Yes, there are questions in the chat, which are questions that I have as well. And I think it's because there's so much interest in this. We've been preaching for so long of the utility of social and behavioral science to challenges of national and global significance, and now we're showing that. And so I think there's a lot of energy for folks to get involved in this. And so you just spoke to that a little bit. on your process for reaching out and learning of experts in these areas. Have you thought of developing a repository or a sign-up form somewhere where folks who are interested could sort of register their interests and their areas of expertise? Or are there other things that you all are doing to get to the folks that you need who have the relevant expertise?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so we actually do have a master spreadsheet, because we've had a number of people reach out to us. And so we sort of start with that list of people who we know would be willing to help on topics as they come up and what their expertise is. And so that's a list that we actually, we rely on as we start to think about these questions that we're gonna answer. So if people have, if people are interested in volunteering, if they have expertise that they think would be really useful, which I'm assuming this group does, you can just reach out and let us know, and we will just keep you on this sheet. And then as there are particular questions that come up that relate, we'll be reaching out to get suggestions of, you know, either volunteers or other experts that we should be talking to.
That's great, and careful what you ask for in this venue, because you'll be inundated, I think, with names of folks who want to help, which is fantastic. Fast forward, you know, to post-COVID someday, having, and you alluded to this earlier, having this infrastructure in place is so valuable and can be used for so many different topics and challenges going forward. And not really a question as much as a really enthusiastic observation that this could also be a really incredible tool for young researchers, emerging researchers who I know are interested. I hear all the time from folks in the academy who are trying to make their research as relevant as possible, and making sure, you know, it's leaving the lab and having some sort of impact on the outside. So there's just so much potential here, I think, with what you all have set up, and it's really, really incredibly exciting.
Thanks. No, we're excited. We see a lot of potential too. And again, we're sort of making it up as we go along. So, so we welcome suggestions.
Awesome. Folks, if you have questions and you want to unmute your lines, you can do that, or you can raise your hand or type them in the chat box. I wanted to ask, you know, you probably get this a lot, and we always ask this of different organizations. We want to be helpful in disseminating the information. Obviously, we share when new reports come out. We shared the announcement when Sean was formed. But who do you want to reach? You know, is it just anyone touching the social science community? We know you want to reach policymakers, but if we can do as a community a better job of making sure that whether it's the findings in the reports that are released or just information about Sean in general, who would you like for this community to help you connect with?
Well, I think as Bob Groves, one of the co-chairs, says, that Sean will have been successful if 5 or 10 years from now, the world looks back and says, wow, social sciences really helped us during that pandemic. And so I think there's an opportunity here to get the word out, to get the products out to a huge audience. You know, with the data guide was the first thing that we did, and it was sort of, you know, weedy. We talk about data and can you think about representativeness, but it's turned out to be really useful for journalists. And so I think there are all kinds of audiences that we don't necessarily think about where this would be appropriate. And if, you know, people have incredible networks. And so I think using their networks to distribute this will hopefully help us reach audiences that we wouldn't have even sort of imagined reaching as we continue this work.
That's really interesting, the journalist piece in particular. And it just goes to show, underscore even more how valuable this is in places you don't even anticipate. One other question I have is, you know, I'm thinking back to during the Obama administration and the social and behavioral sciences team in the White House, which, you know, worked to find efficiencies in federal government using social science insights on a variety of fronts, whether it's getting folks to save for retirement or how to create better forms so that the results, so that federal agencies can better respond to needs, et cetera. But one thing that we heard a lot from that team back in the day was they get so many more requests to work with them than they can handle. And so I'm just curious about what the response rate has been. I know the goal here was to have policymakers at various levels come to you with the questions. Are you now inundated with those questions, or do you still need to reach more policymakers to sort of legitimize this activity and get more uptake of your work?
So we've got a fair number of questions. I mean, the last slide that I shared are ones that are in serious contention for us to do something about, but we have a much broader list. I mean, and some of them are not really appropriate for Sean. As I mentioned, one of the criteria that we use for thinking about what we're going to do would be, is a rapid response kind of, appropriate? A question we got, for example, is that Latinx populations are getting COVID at sort of predictably high rates, but they're not dying at predictably high rates. And that's kind of interesting. And what can we figure out about that would be helpful? And that's a fabulous question, but it's not really appropriate for Sean. And so I think, although this doesn't answer your question, what it's making me think about is there are other really good questions that I think we need to figure out a way to share with other people who may want to sort of pick up these questions that Sean can't. Sean has gotten a number of questions right now. I wouldn't say that we're inundated, but I think we have some work to go forward, and I expect that we'll continue to get some more in. So I'm feeling pretty good about the workload right now.
That's great, and I really appreciate your point about having to decide what's appropriate for Sean to work on, but also recognizing that those questions shouldn't just die off, right? There should be someone, and I know, COSSA and so many of our partner groups have thought for such a long time, how do we create an experts database or some sort of tool where these types of questions can be answered? And so again, I think you all have done so much groundwork laying for the community that hopefully we can build. And if you all are collecting those questions that are not necessarily appropriate for your activity and finding a way to share those with the broader community, I think we can continue to build something really positive. So thank you, Monica, so much. We're gonna close out here in a couple of minutes, but Monica provided her contact information and the Sean email address as well. So feel free to reach out or to us if you have more questions or want to make connections in some way. But really, really want to thank you for participating in this with us. Okay, just in the last minute, our homework assignments for you all, things that we think you should or at least consider working on over the next couple of weeks. As I mentioned, we're at the sort of height of appropriations time right now, and COSSA always has active alerts on our webpage. Now is the time to send off another letter to your policymakers in support of the social science agencies we care about for fiscal year 2021. While that process won't be wrapped up, anytime in the near future, at least in terms of weeks, those decisions, those bills are being written right now. So this is sort of the last chance to make your voices heard on these issues. And then a more general plea, we ask for these all the time, but it's even more important now. We need your examples of social science related to COVID or to policing or to immigration or any other topic with sort of national significance, especially now because we're going through the process of working on what we internally call a transition document, but it's essentially an agenda setting document for the presidential administration, whether the administration changes or not. If President Trump is reelected, usually you see a lot of turnover in the administration, and so you still have to come up with new agenda items to share with those who will be taking leadership roles. And we like to incorporate as much social science as possible in our communications with the administration. So share any stories using our portal on our website there. And you can never send us too much information. We will find a use for just about everything. Okay, we'll be back next month. August 13th is our next headlines. We haven't set the deep dive topic yet, so if there's anything that really interests you, let us know. Shoot any one of us an email and we will try to set up that topic. If not for August, then later on. And you know where to find us online. These are just some of the topics we've had over the last year. If you weren't able to participate live, the recordings and the slides are all available. Last week on police violence was very interesting, and the few before that were COVID related as well. So check those out for the latest information. And we hope to see you again next month. We hope you encourage your colleagues to participate as well. And if you're not receiving our email information for some reason, or the COSSA Washington update, just let any one of us know. The staff's emails addresses are on the screen there, and we can get you all set up. Thank you again for participating. I hope you all stay well and safe and cool as much as possible, and we'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.